You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 30th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead,
Hezbollah, under the command of Hassan Nasrallah, chose to join the war that Hamas started. There are consequences for that decision. Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, will no longer be able to terrorize the world.
That's an IDF spokesperson. As Israel expands its operations into Yemen, we'll catch up with the latest news with our correspondent in Beirut. Mexico's first female president takes office today. We'll examine the legacy of her predecessor and look at the challenges ahead for Claudia Sheinbaum. We'll hear about a deal between Russia and the troubled nations of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger and examine the implications for the region. Then to Indonesia, where the campaign for mayoral elections has kicked off. Our Asia editor tells us why we should be paying attention. Plus, we'll hear about a silent pandemic that claims 1 million lives annually and could become the leading cause of death globally by 2050. And we'll browse the day's papers and have a roundup of news from Asia, including Japan's new cabinet. And also ahead,
here in Ibiza Town, the gastronomic needle is gently tipping towards authenticity and quiet quality. And I'm here to sift through all the noise and non-starters and show you which tables are worth pulling up a chair at.
Liam Aldous guides us through the restaurant scene in Ibiza. That's all coming up here on The Globalist, live from London. Israel has continued to strike Lebanon and claimed to have killed another senior Hezbollah figure in addition to leader Hassan Nasrallah in a dramatic escalation of its bombing campaign that local officials say has left more than 1,000 people dead. Iran, which backs the powerful militant group, vowed the strike that took out Nasrallah will not go unanswered. Well, let's get the latest with Ruth Michelson, who's journalist and Middle East correspondent and joins us now from Beirut. Ruth, many thanks for coming on the show. I wonder if you could describe what's been going on in Beirut since the killing of Nasrallah on Friday.
Well, we've seen that airstrikes have continued mostly on southern parts of the Lebanese capital, but there was one strike last night on the Kola neighborhood, which appears to be the deepest that Israeli forces have struck inside the city in some time, possibly decades. So this is really quite far beyond the southern suburbs or the southern parts of Beirut. We also know that there are strikes continuing further south of Beirut. I mean, you mentioned that over 1,000 people had been killed up until yesterday. The health ministry said that over 105 people were killed across Lebanon yesterday alone. And that, again, we are seeing that Israel is trying to target many of the leading figures of Hezbollah's leadership, leading figures within Hezbollah, as there's still speculation about where and when we will see the funeral for Nasrallah, because that is still something that there's a huge amount of opacity around that.
What's been the reaction from the authorities and the government on the ground, such as it is?
Well, I mean, it's fair to say not a response that a lot of people have said is just insufficient. I mean, there are hundreds, if not maybe even thousands of people who have been sleeping on the streets since the strikes on Dahiyeh in southern Beirut and Burj al Barajneh nearby. These are people who fled their homes in those neighborhoods and there were also Israeli evacuation orders for some of those neighborhoods. And these are people who are sleeping in the streets in parts of central Beirut, in Martyrs Square, on the beach. A lot of these people are saying they simply do not have anywhere else to go. Some of these people were already refugees from places like Syria or guest workers from Bangladesh. And there are estimations from the caretaker Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, that 1 million people could be displaced across Lebanon. But we are not seeing a government or a state that is necessarily putting itself at the forefront of the response to that, apart from maybe parts of the Ministry of Health that are trying to keep track of what's going on, and increased presence from the army on the streets. But really, it's volunteers, it's NGOs that have really been stepping up to make sure that these people who are now simply have no place to go have food and maybe some shelters to stay in temporarily.
So Iran, who are the backers of Hezbollah, have vowed revenge. But with the death of Nasrallah, who would lead it?
Well, the signs that we've been getting from the public statements from Ayatollah Ali Khamenei of Iran, he basically indicated yesterday that it is most likely that the Iranians are looking for Hezbollah to lead this response rather than Iran. So, I mean, he literally said in a statement yesterday that it will be Hezbollah at the helm of what he called the resistance forces that he said will determine the fate of the region. So we're seeing plenty of analysis that, for example, some reporting in the New York Times today that talks about the idea that with the choice between an all-out war between Iran and Israel or Iran lying low in the interests of self-preservation, that Khamenei is choosing the latter.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed. That's Ruth Michelson in Beirut there. And we're going to return to this story a little bit later on in the show to examine the ramifications and the international reaction to the events in the region over the weekend. This is The Globalist. Today, after 6 years in power, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the man credited with changing the way politics is done in Mexico, steps down. So what's his legacy and what challenges face his successor, Claudia Sheinbaum? Well, to answer these questions, I'm joined now by Oscar Guardiola Rivera, who's Professor of International Law and Human Rights at Birkbeck College in the University of London. Oscar, welcome back to the programme. How did Obrador change Mexican politics?
Well, thanks very much for having me, Georgina. Andrés Manuel López Obrador has delivered on what he himself termed the fourth transformation. In terms of its ideals, he spoke on Saturday as having realized a more just and egalitarian moral economy. That was the focus of his government, and the numbers seem to support that statement. In a country of over 100 million inhabitants, more than 10 million Mexicans were lifted from poverty in 5 years. The Gini coefficient is at a historical low. Salary has incremented 135%, and on this basis, as well as many infrastructure achievements, AMLO, as is known by the millions who follow him, says he has delivered on his promises.
So there is some criticism, though, that he hasn't really delivered on infrastructure projects.
That is true. There are quite a few criticisms, not just in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of some of his reforms. It is true to say that the main infrastructure projects have taken longer than he was expected. But for instance, in September, he did inaugurate the first leg of the so-called Maya train. This is a massive infrastructure, perhaps comparable, longer, in fact, that the HS2 here in Britain, and it is suspected that it will spark an economic boom in the southeast of the country. The train will allow tourists to visit the archaeological remains in Chiapas, and there is also the other train communicating Mexico City itself with its surroundings. This is a massive city, much in need of transportation reform. And this Saturday, in fact, while saying goodbye to his followers in Nayarit, he was inaugurating another infrastructure program.
So his position is to be filled by Claudia Sheinbaum. She's the first woman president of Mexico. What's top of her in tray, particularly where foreign policy is concerned?
She has a tough act to follow. I mean, AMLO ends on a popularity high. His popularity right now is in between 67 and 73%. I mean, any president elsewhere in the world would love to finish his or her term with those numbers. The main challenge is, as you pointed out, foreign policy, but also security. And these two are intertwined because of course, Mexico being the closest neighbor in the south to the United States, what happens in the United States immediately affects Mexico and vice versa. So the main challenge in terms of foreign policy is going to be immigration. And on this, Sheinbaum has already pointed out at ongoing plans to open a more secure way for migrants to move, while at the same time pointing out that more migrants have been deported out of Mexico during AMLO's presidency than ever.
Sheinbaum's already embroiled in a diplomatic row with Spain, though, to be fair, this particular argument dates back to the 1500s. Can you tell us more?
This is indeed a very long and complicated matter, or perhaps not so much. Part of the issue has to do with the fact that the head of the state of Spain is the monarch, and Spain, having been the former colonizer of most of Latin America, there is always bound to be some tension. Listeners will remember that Felipe VI, the king of Spain, already got into trouble during the elevation of Colombia's President Gustavo Petro. He refused to stand up when the sword of the liberator of the Americas, Simón Bolívar, was shown. This time, the Spanish monarch refused to answer a letter by AMLO, which asked Spain and Mexico to rewrite or tell the whole truth of the story of colonization together. That was also accompanied by a petition for Spain to express some kind of either apology or regret or the damage made during colonization, especially to indigenous peoples. And this is a matter that is at the heart of Mexico because of its political history, because of its revolutionary history, and because indigenismo, as it is known in Mexico, is always part and parcel, a definitive part and parcel of politics in Mexico.
So this royal row aside, what does Mexico's future look like under Sheinbaum?
It has to be said that the future of Mexico looks better if you compare it to that of other countries in the Western Hemisphere. As I pointed out before, the economic numbers of at the end of AMLO's administration are important, if one might say even impressive. But the main challenge continues to be security. The country is still fighting its underground economy, mostly fueled by the illegality, the prohibitionist approach to narcotics, and that is still an issue. There are other problems. The proposed reform to the judicial power has caused controversy. I just returned from Mexico and saw for myself how entrenched those positions are. Having said that, it is very clear that the people are with both AMLO and Sheinbaum. On the 15th of September, the day of the celebration of Mexican independence, at least 300,000 people flocked to the Zócalo, the main square in Mexico City, to express their support for both AMLO and Sheinbaum.
Oscar, thank you very much indeed. That's Oscar Guardiola Rivera there, and this is The Globalist. It's just coming up to 6:15 in Bamako, 7:15 here in London. Now, Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso, three countries in West Africa who've cut ties with African and Western allies and formed their own alliance of Sahel states, have turned to the Kremlin for help in battling Islamist insurgents. Russia's space agency says it's signed a partnership to provide telecommunications and satellites to the three crisis-racked nations. Well, I'm joined now by Tara O'Connor, Managing Director of Africa Risk Consulting, a Pan-African risk management company. Tara, it's good to have you back on the show. Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger are all ruled by military juntas following successful coups. Since then, they've withdrawn from ECOWAS. They've set up their own alliance. I wonder if you could tell us more about this and their alienation from both regional and Western allies.
Yes, well, they actually have also pulled out, I think, since January last year from ECOWAS, which was the regional defence and commercial pact that has been in existence since the 1970s, and formed their own this alliance for Sahelian states, which is both a defence pact and a commercial, meant to be deepening commercial interests as well. There is also a provision within the agreement for an own currency. But really, it's only the defence pact that seems to be in functioning at the moment.
So who is fighting who and why?
So, well, you've got a series of different groups. First of all, the militaries of all three regions that have been really these three leaders in Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger took power for the most part because of the growing insurgency. You have, in particular, an Al-Qaeda-backed group called Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam, which is operating across all three regions, and then also ethnic Tuareg separatists who've been really fighting for their own country or a separate nation, a separatist nation, since the 1990s, in fact.
What is then the nature of this official deal with Russia?
So the official deal seems to be for the Russian space agency, Roscosmos, to provide telecoms and surveillance satellites. And that the idea is to both improve surveillance in all the border regions, in the very porous border regions of all three countries, but also to supply, I think the idea is also to supply telecoms and also increased capability to monitor such things as flooding. There's been quite a serious set of floods in both Mali and Niger as the Niger River has burst its banks. But it will also give Russia increased surveillance capability in the Sahel.
I mean, this deal has been formally discussed and announced, but is it fair to say all three countries have been relying on Russia unofficially in other ways for some time?
Yes, they have. And it's really since the military coups that have taken place, a string of military coups that have taken place across the Sahel region since 2021. It's also marks a determined nationalist shift by all three countries away from the former colony. They were all former French colonies. And immediately after these coups took place, the junta leaders ordered the regional troops, United Nations troops, French and US troops to leave the region, which resulted in 25,000 Western-backed troops leaving the region, which unfortunately has just opened up the whole territory for increased Islamist extremist activity. And we've actually seen some very dramatic attacks that have taken place, for example, in the Malian capital, Bamako, in the middle of September, and a terrific and a terrifying attack in a central province town in Burkina Faso, where some between 300 and 400 troops and civilian deaths were recorded.
And now that Russia is to be officially welcomed into this part of Africa with a seemingly legitimate stake, what's in it for Russia and what are the regional and global implications?
Well, the real, Russia has actually supplied troops, military trainers, and mercenary forces allegedly to support the militaries of all three regions. But it has been severely criticized. There aren't enough troops. Several have been pulled back to Russia in order to continue the fight against Ukraine. And Russian troops that have been there have been, particularly the mercenary contingents, have been more interested in taking control of the gold, particularly artisanal gold mining areas. And really, that's a lot of what Russia's interest in both the Sahel region, in Sudan. We've seen Russian interest in gold mining in particular, in order to counter the international sanctions. But it does also represent part of this global challenge to Western hegemony, if you would like to call it, the sort of US-dominated world order that both Russia, China and Iran in particular are challenging at the moment.
So, I mean, finally, is this deal between Russia and these three countries likely to improve security in the region?
It's certainly, up to now, Russian military involvement has proved no match for the insurgency that is, which is also, there's a great deal of criminal trafficking. Insurgents are supported by criminal traffickers. But definitely for the people of of all three countries, the security conditions across the Sahel have deteriorated dramatically in the last 12 months.
Tara, thank you very much indeed. That's Tara O'Connor there. Now, still to come on the programme, we profile the mayoral election in Jakarta and how it's set to shape the Indonesian capital. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio with me, Georgina Godwin, and joining me in the studio is Yossi Meckelberg, who's an Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. Yossi, earlier in the programme we were speaking to our correspondent in Beirut, Ruth Michelson, and she made mention of a New York Times piece today, which is really picking apart what's happening in the Middle East and why the world's biggest powers can't stop a war there. Tell us more.
Yes, and that's an interesting thing. You would imagine, you look at the countries in the Middle East, the international community should have so much influence on them. You look at Israel and the relations with the United States, but also with Europe, trade, military power, intelligence sharing, all of this. Not to impose what their will, but at least to have some impact on them, on Israel. France influence allegedly on Lebanon, the NATO, the UN, all of this together can actually have some impact on them a year into the war to avoid even a bigger war. As the region was possibly on the brink of a regional war that everyone says we don't want it, but they are walking into it. why there is no influence. And I think, Roger Cohen in the New York Times tried to unpack it, but I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that the international community at least can, for instance, or the United States, in the case of Israel, push for a ceasefire in Gaza. Then when you look what happens in Lebanon, you would argue that Israel has the right to have this campaign or hold this campaign against Hezbollah because part of the country is empty. I just been there last week, and the north of Israel is basically empty because of Hezbollah's rockets. But following the last 10 days and the elimination of most of the Hezbollah leadership, helped them to get also into the diplomatic sphere, not only in the military one. And look, what is the political endgame? What is the strategy and all of this? But what we see is more bombing and more killing. But then, yes, when it's going to reach a UN resolution, Security Council resolution, it's about pushing Hezbollah to the Litani River. But what we actually hear that there is most possibility for a ground incursion, while the international community is an observer of all of it instead of an acting participant.
And what about the regional powers?
I think they have less influence, but they definitely can influence Hamas when it comes to a ceasefire, the release of the hostages. I think we need a completely new architecture right now in the Middle East. Before October 7, everyone thought about more normalization between Israel and Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia. I know it sounds very old-fashioned to say, basically, it's the peace initiative of 2002. That should create this new discourse that should have been already in 2002, normalization in exchange of a peace agreement between the Israeli Palestinians. And I think through this also deal with now that the Hezbollah militarily is much weaker, also to think in terms how to help Lebanon actually become a viable state. Because the Hezbollah had this, a hold on the entire Lebanese political system. Now, without its leadership, with reduced military capabilities, it's also for the region and other powers to try and create some momentum into changes in the Lebanese political system, because it's always on the brink of collapsing. But they're afraid of you see, they rather take the risk of war than taking risk with political change.
Just before we leave this subject, how significant is the fact that the IDF struck deep in Yemen over the weekend?
I think in this sense Israel and Yemen are not natural enemies. It's quite far away. It's always because the Houthis are decided to keep launching missiles that all of them are intercepted. So it's kind of more sending message. But the message always is not only to the Houthis or to the Hezbollah. It's a message to Tehran. Yes, Israel was caught by complete surprise on October 7. It recovered militarily, I don't think politically, but militarily, and it still has the capability and the capacity to attack also the intelligence and operationally to attack almost any point in the Middle East.
Let's move on. Kamala Harris has been in Arizona. Of course, immigration is a huge issue in the US election. What's the FT saying about this?
And I think it's interesting that it's almost a kind of the tacit criticism. It's not an original opinion about immigration, because she said very different things only 4 years ago. But obviously immigration is a massive issue in the United States. And the Republicans, when it comes to that, the American electorate trust Donald Trump by huge margin when it comes to immigration, because he speaks tough. I mean, it doesn't mean that you always the act tough and doesn't all have the answers, but the American electorate, especially the Republicans, talk tough and talk about building more walls and more legislation to stop immigration from entering into the United States. Again, it's in most of the Western world, there is not an intelligent conversation about immigration. It's about that, we need migration, but we don't like migrants. So this kind of the combination, and that's, I think, Kamala Harris is falling. Instead of presenting an alternative, she goes to Arizona. We have to remember, Arizona is one of the 7 swing states. which it's 1.5%, which within the margin of errors of any opinion polls. So she thinks by going to the border, being in Arizona, talking about being tough on immigration, she might just close a little. She won't win on migration, but if she closes just a little bit on the gap, it might swing towards the Democrats. I think time will tell, because Arizona is a key state. The question is, of course, it's the toxic discourse about migration in the United States. The Democrats are actually, again, playing into where is the Republican strength instead of the other way around. She's actually risking alienating some of her own base when she talks stuff about migration.
Yossi, let's look at something light, shall we? About how we're all going to be wiped out by asteroids, or not.
So forget about all these wars in the Middle East. Forget about climate change. It's the asteroids that are going to hit us. And I must admit, I'm not an expert on it, but when I saw this article in The Guardian and realized that 1 meter asteroids can cause a lot of damage, 50 meter asteroids can actually wipe out a city, let alone a 100 one. So then there are a lot of people there quietly building a sort of an iron dome for asteroids that will deflect them, will intercept them, and even sending to space asteroid hunters just to make sure that they don't hit us. And all the debates that we are having here about the dangers that we are human beings inflicting on our planet will pale into insignificant if eventually an asteroid, a big one, will hit planet Earth. It's just when I read it, I thought about all these movies. It's based on our fear. When you think about all this movie, we are hiding behind a big box of popcorn when an asteroid is just about hit and the hero in the movie is saving planet Earth. Actually, there are these scientists, the heroes, that are trying just to do that.
Which is very comforting.
It is, yeah.
Yossi Meckelberg, thank you very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israel should not be allowed to attack countries in the Iran-aligned axis of resistance, one after the other, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said yesterday. Israel said it had bombed Houthi targets in Yemen on Sunday, expanding its confrontation with Iran's allies in the region after killing the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah on Friday in an escalating conflict in Lebanon. US President Joe Biden has approved $567 million in defense support for Taiwan, the White House said on Sunday. The latest move by the United States to boost the island's military in the face of rising tensions with China. The United States is Taiwan's most important international backer and arms supplier, even in the absence of formal diplomatic ties. China has repeatedly demanded Washington stop selling weapons to Taipei, which it claims as its territory. And today, Austria's far-right Freedom Party, the FPO, must seek to clear a path to power after its historic parliamentary election victory left the anti-establishment outfit needing a partner to form a governing coalition. The FPO finished around 2.5 percentage points ahead of Chancellor Karl Nehammer's Conservative People's Party to capture some 29% of the vote, its best result ever. No party is willing to govern with it. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It's a big year for democracy in Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous country and the most populous Muslim-majority country. There was a presidential vote in February, and today campaigning begins for local elections in November. Well, I'm joined now by James Chambers, who's Monocle's Asia editor. James, welcome back. Indonesia comprises some 17,000 islands, so this election involves many hundreds of candidates. Why is it that the only race that really matters is that of a governor for the largest city, Jakarta?
Hi, Georgina. Yes, that's right. I mean, Indonesia is a sprawling nation. But most of the economic, political and cultural power is all concentrated on one of those islands, and that's the island of Java. And Jakarta is the main city on Java. And it's a bit like, London in the UK or Bangkok to Thailand. Everything is about Jakarta. And even now, with the outgoing president Jokowi trying to move the capital to a more geographical central position in Indonesia, nothing's really going to change. Everything's going to stay very much in Jakarta. So even though in November there's going to be these huge local elections, picking governors and mayors and these people called regents around the nation, it really is only Jakarta that really matters, because that race is a big platform for politicians who have their eye on the biggest prize, which is becoming president of the country. So being governor of Jakarta is a very big platform to then launch an election bid for president.
Who's on the ballot?
Well, it really is a kind of a two-horse race, and one of the leading candidate is a guy called Ridwan Kamil, who Monocle readers might be quite familiar with. He was an architect by training, but then he went on to be mayor of Bandung, which is a city on Java. And then he became the governor of West Java, which is a province next to Jakarta. So he's on the ballot, and he's going up against a kind of insider who used to be in Jokowi's cabinet and is representing the PDIP, which is was Jokowi's party, but then Jokowi kind of fell out with the person in charge of the PDIP. So it's very much seen as, I guess I'd say Ridwan Kamil, the other guy, is perhaps Jokowi's pick.
I wonder how much of their success or indeed failure depends on the backing of powerful political dynasties like Jokowi.
Well, I'd say a lot. And what's interesting about Jokowi is that, he came to power as a real outsider. He wasn't from the elites in Jakarta. He came from Java, as everyone must do, but he wasn't from Jakarta. And his whole shtick was, I'm an outsider, I'm going to change things. I don't want to start a dynasty. I don't want my kids to be in politics. And he was very popular. He was very much a man of the people. But actually, over time, as he's been, got comfortable in the parliament, in the presidential palace, he's very much changed his tune. And people might have noticed that actually his eldest son, Gibran, is going to be the vice president. So when Jokowi steps down next month and makes way for the next president, a real Jakarta old-timer called Prabowo, his vice president is going to be Jokowi's eldest son. So there was all kinds of deals that were made between Jokowi and Prabowo to make sure that Jokowi could keep a handle on power. And actually Jokowi or Jokowi's people even tried to get his youngest son into the race for one of the governor positions in the elections in November. But Jokowi's youngest son isn't old enough. He's only 29, and there are rules stipulating that you have to be at least over 30. And they even tried to change the rules, like they had done with his elder son. That was eventually stopped by the courts. But it's just another signal of how Jokowi is going to try and influence Indonesia even after he steps down next month.
And in terms of the mayoral elections, who would be the smartest choice for Jakarta?
Well, it's an interesting time for Jakarta. As most people will probably know, they always describe it as the sinking city because it's under sea level and it's regularly flooded. So you're always looking for a governor who can address those problems. So they need someone, who can really, hold the tides back and protect Jakarta. And also, as I said before, Jokowi is trying to build a new capital, Nusantara, and trying to move at least the political power base out of Jakarta. I don't see that happening. I think once Jokowi actually does step down, all the energy and enthusiasm for that new capital will probably fizzle away, and Prabowo as president will just continue to stay in Jakarta. But at the moment, Jakarta needs someone who's going going to fly the flag for the city. And Ridwan Kamil, could be that guy. He's a guy who can, have a foot in both camps. He can be the international guy who looks good to investors, and he also can, play a bit of a, man of the people. He's from a town outside of Jakarta, and I have been, when he was running for West Java governor, I did go on a ride along with him in his SUV, and it was so fascinating to see the back of his car full of these different outfits. So when we paid a visit on a mosque, he put on the right gear to look like the devout Muslim, and then when we were going to see some local people, he was a man of the people, and then he can easily be the international architect and hobnob with the great and the good. So he has that kind of dexterity that Jakarta needs to really kind of shine, and everyone is looking at Indonesia now as as people are shifting away from China. It could be Indonesia's time in the sun. So, it'll be interesting to see who actually wins. There's more to it than just what's good for Jakarta. This is very much a race for the presidency in 2029 as well. So we'll have to see whether Ridwan Kamil has what it takes. And there's also an undercurrent of why Jokowi and his people might be supporting him, because ultimately they want Jokowi's son to be president, and perhaps there's an argument that they might be supporting Ridwan Kamil because they don't see him as a threat. So there's a lot in play in November.
Monocle's Asia editor James Chambers there. You're with Monocle Radio. It is 2:40 in Bridgetown, 8:40 in Zurich. Now, you may not know what AMR is yet. Well, think back to December 2019, where we were just becoming familiar with the name COVID-19. Well, similarly, antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, is a condition that needs to be taken seriously. And that's why it was the subject of a health-focused event during the United Nations General Assembly. Speaking to the press after the high-level meeting on AMR, Mia Mottley, who's the Prime Minister of Barbados, said that it's already a silent pandemic that claims 1 million lives annually and is indirectly responsible for nearly 4 million more. By 2050, it could become the leading cause of death globally. Well, I'm joined now by Stephen Harris, who's a science journalist and the deputy editor of The Conversation. Stephen, thanks for coming on the show. What is AMR?
AMR is antimicrobial resistance. It's essentially the ability of germs to resist or survive the drugs that are currently used to kill them, like antibiotics.
And how and why does this happen?
It's often due to over or incorrect use of antibiotics. So, for example, if you have an infection and you go to the doctor and get some antibiotics, if you don't take the full course of antibiotics, some will be left in your system, and they will most likely be the strongest, most able to survive bugs, which will then thrive and multiply, and all of the bugs that come next will have that same strength. Equally, if you have a virus, for example, colds are often caused by a virus. COVID, of course, is caused by a virus, and you badger your doctor for antibiotics. Antibiotics aren't actually going to do anything, but if you take them, it may then have an effect on other bacteria in the system with a similar effect.
And so why has AMR become such a threat?
You mentioned it before that there's a risk of millions of people essentially dying as an indirect result of this, because the stronger that infections get, that bacteria get, and it's not just actually bacteria, that's why we call it antimicrobial resistance. It does affect other pathogens such as viruses in certain ways. The stronger that they get, the harder it is for the existing drugs that we have to fight them. If it's only the strongest bugs left, then the drugs that we have don't kill them. And this is why you get things like superbugs that we often hear about in hospitals, where certain infections, and it can be even quite common infections, things responsible for things like UTI, urinary tract infection, are just becoming harder and harder to treat because the antibiotics that we have at the moment are now less effective because of this problem.
So how can we tackle it? What decisive action will be taken? Did Mia Mottley's speech give any indication?
You can look to the declaration that the United Nations General Assembly agreed last week. it's a bit like the Paris Climate Agreement in some ways. It's a shared recognition of the seriousness of the problem and the need to do something. And also, there seems to be agreement on what is the problem. And that is obviously, as I've said, it's overuse, it's misuse. But also it's actually worth bearing in mind that up to 80% of antibiotics are used in livestock, in agriculture. So there's a big issue there to be solved as well. But actually what the declaration noted was how much of this is to do with inadequate healthcare, especially in the developing world. If you have inadequate supplies of clean water, if you have inadequate access to vaccines, infections are more likely to spread in the first place. And that puts much greater pressure on our antibiotics that we have to work against them. Indeed, the supply of antibiotics is a problem, because if you don't have the antibiotics that can treat an infection and stop it very quickly, then that infection will spread and grow and the problem becomes worse.
Is the world taking this seriously enough, and how can we as individuals protect ourselves?
It's sort of difficult to know, because with the Paris Climate Agreement, this agreement is essentially a recognition of the problem and an agreement that we ought to do something. And there are some targets in it. So there's an aim for 70% of antibiotics by 2030 to come from a group that are known to have the lowest potential to cause antimicrobial resistance. So we're agreeing that we should use the best antibiotics, essentially. But there's also a lot of general aims and targets that don't have a lot of specifics. I mean, I mentioned the significance of antibiotic use in agriculture. There's only a general agreement that, well, we ought to do something about that. There isn't a specific target there. And also, like the Paris Climate Agreement, what this does is it leaves it up to individual nations to work out their own plans for how they're going to tackle this. It's a general agreement that we ought to do something. There's not yet a clear roadmap of exactly how we or any individual nation does it.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. That was Stephen Harris, and this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
We're going to return to Indonesia now, as it's time to talk business and Asia news with Erin Cook. She's a Jakarta-based journalist and author of Dari Mulut ke Mulut, a newsletter about Southeast Asia. Erin, we've got some breaking news that's happened just while we've been on air. A snap election has been called in Japan. Tell us more.
Yes, it's all happening in Tokyo. Of course, last week, Shigeru Ishiba was elected president of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, and he was widely expected to be named as Prime Minister tomorrow, local time. And he's had a bit of a cabinet reshuffle, but he says, no, forget all that. Let's go straight to an election. So he wants to dissolve the House today and an election to be held on the 27th. He wants to clear the decks after a scandalous few years for the ruling LDP and see if he can sort of get it together for a new Japan and a new LDP.
Fascinating story, which I'm sure we'll be following up in some depth later today. Let's go to Thailand now and this long-awaited marriage equality bill. Tell us more.
Yes, this is an interesting one. Thailand has been talking on and off about bringing in marriage equality for decades. It's the only Southeast Asian country to get anywhere near it. And now that the monarchy last week officially sort of ticked the box to say, let's do it, the country's now on a countdown. It's 120 days, about 3 months until it will officially come through. So for Thailand's wedding planners and venue owners and all this, it's a really exciting time. Everybody's sort of on the move now to put together new package deals and new honeymoon promos for all these couples that were for so long shut out of these options.
Activists are warning about being pinkwashed.
Yes, there's already some concerns that the excitement in Bangkok and across the country now might not live up to what the promise is in a few years down the line. So they're saying, just keep an eye out. It could be that they're they're interested in, advertising to you and marketing to you now. But in a few years, once all the excitement dies down, make sure you're getting your rights. Keep an eye out. Make sure that the banks aren't picking on you. They're letting you get what you need to get. The government especially, you need to be making sure that just because the law's changed, they're being enforced as well.
Now, Vietnam has a new president, as we know, but he's just made his first trip to the US since taking the top job. He had a really important meeting with Joe Biden. What's the detail on that?
Yes, this is a really, really important one. So To Lam, he met met Joe Biden on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly last week. The US has been very, very keen to rebuild relationships with Vietnam over sort of the dramatic last few decades. And Vietnam likewise is very keen to deepen business ties across the world. So Biden would have been very, very happy to have met with To Lam there. There are some concerns from the US, though, that Vietnam continues to sort of still be quite friendly with countries that the US isn't so keen about anymore, especially Russia and China, which, of course, Vietnam has had long-running ties with in sort of various iterations over the years. But Vietnam is very keen to see this strategic partnership that was hatched earlier in the year turn into some very big financial opportunities in the future. So I think we'll see what happens there.
I mean, what is the significance then of the American and the United States Indo-Pacific sort of joint agreement or what they're planning there?
Well, that's it. The US is trying very, very hard to kind of assert itself within the Indo-Pacific. It sees itself as a ballast against rising China. So Vietnam is an important plank there. There's been some tensions, of course, between Vietnam and the US in the past, but because Vietnam is becoming a manufacturing and a business powerhouse, it's becoming a bit more pro-US than it has been in the past. And for the US, that's a really, really good sign to have such a strong, well, not quite an ally, but a strong friend in the region. Whether Vietnam politically wants to get that close to Washington is a whole other question. So I think, this meeting on the sidelines of the UN may tell us a lot in the coming months about where that relationship is heading.
Because Vietnam traditionally has been content going its own way.
Absolutely. Yep. And I wouldn't get too excited saying that this is, Vietnam becoming best friends with the US. It, of course, hosted Vladimir Putin earlier in the year. To Lam has been across the border into Beijing plenty of times, both as president and in his party roles and previous ministerial roles. So this isn't the sign, I suppose, about a shift in those relationships, but it is maybe an indication of sort of a all hands, all friends with everybody approach for Vietnam.
Let's go to Malaysia now. No sugar in the house.
Poor old Malaysia. So Malaysia has some of the highest rates of obesity and diabetes in the region, particularly amongst young people. So the public health experts in Malaysia have been trying to do all sorts of manoeuvres there. They've got all sorts of ideas. The government's a bit not too sure what to do, but they've got one idea, and that's to make Wednesdays sugar-free in Parliament House. So MPs will have their drinks checked when they come in the door to make sure that there's not any additional sugar in it. Healthy food only. So they're trying to lead by example with a healthy sugar-free Wednesday.
A sugar-free Wednesday. How is that going down there?
I think it's one of these things that sounds very charming in concept, but once it came out that this would also apply to the Malaysian press pen, it may go a bit differently. They will no longer be able to bring coffee with a couple of sugars in on a Wednesday, so maybe the public sentiment might change there.
Erin Cook, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. On the Balearic island of Ibiza, the summer season is beginning to wind down. But the legions of leisure seekers won't officially dwindle until mid-October, when many of the island's restaurants head off on their half-year hiatus. Monocle's correspondent Liam Aldous brings us a tour of the culinary scene of Ibiza Town.
When you head into Ibiza Town for a good bite or even a tidy drink, one quickly crashes into a bit of a conundrum. How is it that a place so full of people looking to sate their hedonistic appetites, somewhere so awash with money and swimming in the culture of spectacle, that there are still so few quality, grounded, worthwhile restaurants to be found? You know, that type of place where you can really taste the love in the food. There's a double-edged answer to this frustrating question. On one side, there are the brute consequences of a tourism economy that caters to seasonal crowds, perpetually geared to the pursuit of big summer profit margins. But then comes the counterpunch. More recently, things have actually started getting better. Here in Ibiza Town, the gastronomic needle is gently tipping towards authenticity and quiet quality. And I'm here to sift through all the noise and non-starters and show you which tables are worth pulling up a chair at. The capital of Ibiza, affectionately known as Ibiza Town to visitors, but Ibiza in the local Ibizanc dialect, is a centuries-old port settlement with a picturesque walled citadel that has gradually expanded into a small city. Our first dry port of call, so to speak, rings a more familiar tune.
Lo que pasa en el Teatro Pereira se queda en el Teatro Pereira.
Teatro Pereira is both old and new again. Built in 1899, this year it reopened after a bold renovation, reinventing itself as a dinner and show destination with a kitschy new musical called Hippie Heaven, which profiles the cultural impact of the island's 60s and 70s immigration.
Oh, you need it slow!
This is the kind of place, glitzy and garish, that many people think of when lazily clutching to Ibiza stereotypes. Like it or not, these places are part of Ibiza's leisure fabric. There are several others around the marina too, all with their big-name chefs and overpriced bottles. But in a way, the industrial light and magic blaring from such venues steals the limelight from the surrounding food scene. So let's tuck into the antidote.
Qué bueno está, me lo voy a tomar entero.
153 years open, real, with the same name, with the same look, everything. The food not, because they make it my grandmother and my grandfather do it, but it's like this.
Carlos Marí is the third-generation owner of the Old Town's oldest restaurant. It opened as a fisherman's haunt in 1870, but Carlos's grandparents took it over in 1948. The fare here is still very much a ma and pa affair. Simple, tasty, and underpriced plates, namely Spanish staples with a hint of German or Italian spice. But there's a catch.
Sometimes you share the table with the strangers, but that's the magic of my restaurant.
Around the corner, you'll also find Fonda Can Costa, another stoic, still surviving ma and pa eatery, semi-subterranean and still using a wood fire oven to grill the plates of squid, sea bass, paella and steaks. An undeniable spirit of spontaneity rules this island, but this can present a bit of a challenge when dinner time arrives. The best remedy for this pickle is to venture up towards Sarpeña, the elevated, grittier former fisherman's quarter. On your way up, a little past the strip of gay-friendly bars, including room service, who are the popular new cocktail makers on the block, you'll find Sakova, a petite French bistro with a clutch of terrace tables and an ever-changing menu of summer-friendly French cuisine. Tonight, I'm venturing a little further into the narrow labyrinthine streets to meet Boris Buono, a Danish-Italian Noma-trained chef whose secluded high-end eatery simply likes to do its own thing.
The people who get here, they're climbing a mountain to come and see me. that means also that they are really, really engaged in what's going to happen. And the good thing about it, there's no red carpet. You can't throw your Mercedes G-Wagon in front of my restaurant. But when you come in here, you get effing quality and quality people. We have the best guests in the whole world. I've never worked in a restaurant where the guests are just so unique, so fantastic, so lovely, and so engaged in what we do.
Boris is renowned as one of the island's early natural cooking pioneers, preferencing fresh Balearic seafood and creative concoctions of vegetables, or his famous sourdough bread. While he has a global cult following, he's also bullish about the local food scene.
It's rising up again, and it's mainly due to the fact that there's more people living in Ibiza Town all year round.
Back in the lower part of town, another hidden gem is Omakase by Walt, an 8-seat sushi restaurant overseen by a half-German, Lithuanian, yet Venezuelan-born chef who traveled the world before opening his dream venture here in 2021. Be advised though, this beautiful bolt hole already boasts a long waiting list. Away from the yachts bobbing in the marina, the more modern part of Ibiza is home to some other upstart ventures. There's Cheetah's Cantina, owned by a trio of friends that by elevating the Mexican menu and drinks has a loyal all-year-round crowd. Around the corner, you'll find David Riarte's playful tapas restaurant Riart, where Spanish seafood and vegetables such as calçots are flavored with Asian and occasionally Lebanese influences. While the night rules in Ibiza, the daytime food scene is also picking up pace. Around the corner from the busy, modern, fresh food market Mercat Now, I'm stopping into Fantastic for a quick pick-me-up cup.
We had a very clear idea that we want to focus on local target that is here all year round, to work all year round.
Co-founder Joanna Monalache opened this coffee and bakery corner on the 2nd of the 2nd, 2022, and it's now so popular that a small line often forms out front. A second location is mooted for this autumn.
And I think it's very nice to have a coffee here in the terrace and just observe all kind of people that are passing by. It's a good definition of Ibiza.
You've got a very cheeky look on your face. If there's one overriding theme in Ibiza Town, it's the battle for attention, a mad scramble to fill seats and tickle fancies. But while the cacophony of hungry crowds and EDM-laced air is primed to distract, the best navigation strategy is to sniff out the places with more grounded, long-term visions, places that are committed to serving the local population all year round, and despite the island's intensity, are still passionate about their craft. On this choose-your-own-adventure island, you invariably find plenty more treats when you're prepared to wander off the bustling beaten paths. But it's always best to know where you're going, because who knows where you'll end up. For Monocle in Ibiza, I'm Liam Aldis.
Many thanks there to Liam. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Angelica Jobson, Carlotta Rebello and Hassan Anderson, our researcher, Sana Jamani, and our studio manager, Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and I'm here to guide you through our programmes for the next few hours, and I'll be back with The Briefing, which is live at midday in London. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.